We tell ourselves that empires fall by the sword, by the roar of cannons, or by the starving cries of the populace in the city squares. We look for the great, catastrophic event that marks the end of an era. But the truth is, it began to crumble the moment a vow was betrayed. In the late 18th century, in a kingdom nestled in the heart of Europe, the air was perpetually thick with the scent of damp stone and old velvet. It was a time when the world was beginning to shift, when the divine right of kings was being quietly questioned in the coffee houses of the capital, though the monarchy itself still stood tall, a gilded cage impenetrable to the common eye. At the center of this cage stood Queen Eleanor. To the court, she was a monument rather than a woman. She was the marble pillar that held up the roof of the dynasty. Eleanor was not native to this land. She had come here 30 years prior, a terrified girl of 16, traded like a fine tapestry to secure a border alliance. She had brought with her a dowry of gold that filled the depleted treasury, and a lineage so ancient it made the king's own family tree look like a sapling. She had not come for love. In those days and in her station, love was a fairy tale told to milkmaids, not a reality for the daughters of dukes. She had come for duty. She had come to be the vessel of the future and the guardian of the present. Over 3 decades, she had buried 3 children and raised 2. She had weathered wars, navigated the treacherous currents of court factions, and turned a foreign court that viewed her with suspicion into a kingdom that viewed her with reverent fear. King Frederick, in his youth, had been a man of vitality. He was not a scholar, nor a philosopher, but he possessed a certain charisma, a loudness that passed for strength. He was a sword, and Eleanor became the shield. They were partners in the truest sense of the word. It was a marriage built not on the shifting sands of passion, but on the bedrock of shared survival. They sat opposite each other at long tables. They stood side by side on balconies, and they presented a united front that no minister dared to breach. But time is a cruel thief, and it had stolen differently from the king than it had from the queen. Eleanor had aged like fine iron. She had hardened, become sharper, her graying hair pinned back severely, her eyes missing nothing. She had sacrificed her softness. She had sacrificed the possibility of being known, truly known, by another human being. She had locked away the girl who once liked to paint watercolors and play the harpsichord, replacing her with a woman who read treaties by candlelight and understood the price of grain better than the chancellor. Frederick, however, had not hardened. He had softened. As his 60s approached, the vitality that had defined him began to curdle into indulgence. The burdens of state, which he had once carried with boisterous arrogance, now seemed to crush him. He grew weary of the endless meetings, the drone of the advisers, the rigid expectations of a station. He began to look for comfort rather than victory. The court noticed, of course. Courts always notice. They saw the king's hand tremble when he reached for his wine. They saw his gaze drift during the audiences with foreign ambassadors. They saw him looking for a place to rest his head that was not burdened by the crown. And every time he faltered, Eleanor was there to subtly correct the course. A whispered word, a firm hand on his arm, a glare that silenced a snickering courtier. She covered his weaknesses with her own strength, as she had done for 30 years. She believed this was the natural order of things. This was the contract they had signed with their lives. She provided the will. He provided the legitimacy. She assumed that as they entered the winter of their lives, they would rely on each other even more, 2 old soldiers who had survived the battlefield together. She believed that their shared history, the griefs, the triumphs, the sheer length of their endurance, was a bond that could not be broken. It was a quiet evening in November when the ship began, though it was invisible to the naked eye. The wind was howling against the high windows of the dining hall, rattling the panes in their lead casings. The king and queen were dining alone, a ritual they maintained to discuss matters too sensitive for the ears of servants. Frederick was picking at a roasted pheasant, his face flushed, his eyes watery. He looked across the expanse of the table at Eleanor. She was reading a dispatch from the southern border, her spectacles perched on the end of her nose, a glass of water untouched beside her. "Eleanor," he said, his voice raspy. She looked up, marking her place with a finger. "Yes, Frederick." "Do you ever tire of it?" "Tire of what?" "The wait," he said, gesturing vaguely at the room. The papers, the unseen kingdom beyond the walls. The endless necessity of being us. Eleanor removed her spectacles and set them down. She looked at the man she had spent her life supporting. She saw the lines of exhaustion, but she also saw something else, a petulant longing, a desire to be absolved of responsibility. "We are not permitted to tire, Frederick," she said gently, but with the firmness of a governess. "We are the crown. The stone does not tire of holding the wall." He sighed a long, rattling sound and looked away. "I suppose not. You are always so strong, Eleanor. Sometimes I wonder if you're made of flesh at all." It was meant as a compliment, perhaps, or a lament, but in hindsight it was an accusation. He was looking for warmth, for a reflection of his own weakness, and she offered only the mirror of duty. She did not know then that he had already found a place where he did not have to be strong. She did not know that while she was securing his legacy, he was beginning to resent the very discipline she represented. She went back to her reading. He went back to his wine. The silence that filled the room was familiar, but it was no longer the silence of partnership. It was the silence of a dam beginning to crack. Hairline fractures appearing deep beneath the surface, unnoticed until the water breaks through. The original order, the structure she had given her entire life to maintain, was intact in appearance only. The rot had already begun. Betrayal does not always arrive with the stealth of a thief in the night. Sometimes it arrives with the clumsiness of a second adolescence. It enters a life not through a locked door forced open, but through a window left slightly ajar by vanity. For Queen Eleanor, the first warnings were not written in letters or whispered by spies. They were written in the small, mundane alterations of a routine that had remained unchanged for decades. Marriage, after 30 years, becomes a language of rhythm. You know the sound of your partner's footsteps, the precise weight of their silence, the specific tenor of their sigh at the end of a long day. When that rhythm stumbles, even slightly, the ear attuned to it notices immediately. It began in the depths of winter. The palace was drafty, the stone corridors trapping the cold, forcing the court to huddle near the great hearths. Usually, during these months, King Frederick would complain incessantly about his joints, about the damp, about the sheer misery of the season. He would retreat into a sour mood that required Eleanor's constant management to prevent it from spilling over into diplomatic insults. But that year the complaints ceased. Frederick began to hum. It was a jarring sound, a tuneless melody he would drift into while staring out the window at the snow-covered gardens. He began to dress with a fastidiousness he had abandoned years ago. He requested new waistcoats of brighter silk, fussed over the trim of his beard, and ordered scents of citrus and clove from the apothecary, scents that belonged to a man courting, not a man ruling. Eleanor observed this with a detached curiosity. At first, she attributed it to a fever of the mind, perhaps a desperate attempt to stave off the reminder of his own mortality. She had seen aging men do foolish things before, buy fast horses, commission flattering portraits, drink too much wine. If this was his way of raging against the dying of the light, she would tolerate it. She would let him have his brighter waistcoats if it kept the peace. Then came the absences. They were trivial at first. He would be late to the morning prayer. He would vanish for an hour in the afternoon, claiming he needed to inspect the stables or visit the kennels. When he returned, he did not smell of horses or dogs. He smelled of fresh air and a strange, nervous energy. He seemed lighter, unburdened, but also distracted. When Eleanor spoke to him of tax levies or the unrest in the northern provinces, his eyes would glaze over. He would nod too quickly, agreeing to things he hadn't heard, eager only to end the conversation. It was the behavior of a boy hiding a sweetmeat in his pocket. The object of this newfound lightness was difficult to pinpoint, because she was designed to be invisible. Her name was Anna, a girl of perhaps 20, the daughter of a minor clerk in the royal household. She had been assigned to the linen staff, one of the dozens of faceless servants who moved to the palace like ghosts, changing sheets, dusting mantles, pouring wine. Anna was not a beauty in the classic sense. She had none of the sharp, cultivated elegance of the court ladies. She was plain-faced, with wide, trusting eyes and a laugh that was too loud for polite society. But she possessed the one thing Eleanor could no longer offer, uncomplicated adoration. To Eleanor, Frederick was a king, a partner, a man with duties and flaws. To Anna, he was simply a hero. She looked at him not with the critical eye of a wife who knew his history, but with the wide-eyed wonder of a subject who saw only the crown. Eleanor did not see them together often. It was the negative space that revealed the truth. She noticed that when Anna entered the room to stoke the fire, Frederick's posture changed. He would sit straighter. The sourness would vanish from his face, replaced by a soft, indulgent smile that he tried to hide behind his goblet. He would make small jokes, trivial comments about the weather or the wood, specifically for the benefit of the girl kneeling at the hearth. One evening, during a small musical performance in the Queen's chambers, Eleanor witnessed a moment that chilled her more than the winter wind rattling the panes. A tray of crystal glasses was dropped. The sound was shattering, cutting through the music. It was Anna who had slipped, her face turning crimson with terror as the shards scattered across the rug. In the rigid protocol of the court, such clumsiness was unforgivable. The steward stepped forward instantly to reprimand her, to banish her from a room. But Frederick was out of his chair before the steward could speak. "Leave it," the king commanded, his voice trembling slightly. He walked over to where the girl stood trembling. He did not yell. He did not ignore her, as a king should ignore a servant's error. He reached out and, for a fraction of a second, his hand hovered near her arm, a gesture of protective intimacy that was shocking in its tenderness. "It is only glass," he said softly, his eyes locked on hers. "Go on, child. It is of no consequence." The room went silent. The musicians paused. The ladies in waiting exchanged glances behind their fans. To the casual observer, it was an act of benevolent mercy from a kindly monarch. But Eleanor, sitting rigid in her high-backed chair, saw the truth. She saw the way Anna looked up at him, not with fear, but with a flushed, secret gratitude. She saw the way Frederick looked down at her, as if she were the only porcelain thing in a room worth preserving. He had not looked at Eleanor with that degree of softness in 20 years. He returned to his seat, clearing his throat, feigning annoyance at the interruption, but the damage was done. The air in the room had shifted. The unspoken contract of their marriage, that they were a united front, elevated above the base desires of common men, had been breached. Eleanor felt a coldness settle in her chest, a heavy, leaden weight. It was not jealousy, exactly. Jealousy implies passion, and passion had long since burned to ash between them. This was something far more dangerous. It was a loss of dignity. By stooping to this, by seeking comfort in the arms of a girl who could not possibly understand the burden of his crown, Frederick was not just betraying his wife. He was betraying his station. He was making himself small. She looked at him across the room. He was avoiding her gaze, drinking his wine too quickly, his face flushed. He looked foolish. He looked like an old man trying to wear a young man's clothes. And for the first time in their long life together, Eleanor did not feel the urge to cover his weakness or correct his course. She felt only a quiet, simmering revulsion, and the dawning realization that the partner she had relied on was already gone. The king was dead. Only the man remained, and he was failing. The human mind is a master of bargaining. It will construct elaborate scaffolds of denial to protect itself from the pain of a collapsed reality. For weeks, Queen Eleanor lived within this scaffold. She told herself that the king was merely suffering from a senile infatuation, a fleeting madness that would pass with the turning of a season. She told herself that his kindness to the girl was paternal, the misplaced affection of a man who missed his own distant children. She might have maintained this fiction indefinitely, had the king not made the mistake of mixing his lies with the business of the state. It concerned a miniature portrait. In the 18th century, portraits were the currency of diplomacy. A miniature, painted on ivory and set in gold, was a token of high alliance, sent to cousins in Austria or potential suitors in France. When Frederick commissioned the court painter, a man of expensive talents, to create a new likeness of himself, Eleanor assumed it was for the upcoming negotiations with the Prussian ambassador. "It must be done quickly," Frederick had said at breakfast, buttering his bread with a shaking hand. The Prussians value gestures of goodwill. They need to see the face of the man they are treating with. Eleanor had nodded, approving of his sudden interest in foreign policy. She even felt a flicker of relief. Perhaps the fog was lifting. Perhaps he was returning to his duties. She signed the authorization for the painter's fee herself, dipping the quill into the ink with a steady hand. 3 weeks later, the Prussian negotiations concluded. The ambassador departed, laden with gifts of wine and tapestries, but with no portrait. Eleanor sat in her study, the manifest of gifts before her. She scanned the list twice. 6 bolts of velvet, 2 casks of Rhenish wine, 1 silver-hilted sword. The miniature was not there. A cold precision took hold of her mind. She did not storm into the king's chambers. She did not summon the painter to interrogate him. Instead, she waited. She waited for the sun to dip low, casting long, bruised shadows across the castle grounds. She knew the rhythms of the palace. She knew where the cracks in the stone were. She walked out into the east garden. It was a secluded place, walled off by high hedges of yew, intended for quiet contemplation. In the winter, it was a skeletal place, a maze of bare branches and frostbitten earth. She heard the voice before she saw the figure. It was a soft, humming sound, the same tuneless melody Frederick had been humming for months. Eleanor stepped through the archway of the hedge. There, sitting on a stone bench, wrapped in a rough woolen shawl, was Anna. The girl was alone. She was not working. She was not rushing to attend a fire or scrub a floor. She was sitting in the stillness, her head bowed over something in her lap. Eleanor approached silently. The velvet of her gown absorbed the sound of her footsteps. She stopped 10 paces away. The girl was holding the golden case of the miniature. It was open. The setting caught the dying light, flashing with the brilliance of diamonds. Diamonds that Eleanor knew had been pulled from the loose stones of the treasury, meant for the repair of the crown jewels. Anna was not just looking at the portrait. She was speaking to it. She was tracing the line of the painted jaw with a rough, red thumb, whispering words too low to hear, but unmistakable in their cadence. It was the whisper of a lover to a beloved. Then, the girl did something that shattered the last of Eleanor's defenses. She lifted the golden oval to her lips and kissed the painted face of the king. It was a gesture of such proprietary intimacy, such delusional ownership, that Eleanor felt the breath leave her body. The girl believed she loved him. Worse, the girl believed he belonged to her. And in that moment, Eleanor realized the portrait had not been a gift of state. It had been a gift of surrender. Frederick had not just given this child a trinket. He had given her his image. He had allowed her to hold him in her hands, to own a piece of the king that the queen could not touch. He had taken the funds of the realm, money meant to secure the safety of their borders, and transmuted it into a love token for a chambermaid. Anna looked up. Her eyes went wide. The color drained from her face, leaving her as pale as the winter sky. She scrambled to her feet, the locket clutched tight against her chest, her knuckles white. She did not curtsy. She stood frozen, like a deer caught before the hunter's bow. Eleanor did not speak. She did not demand the locket. She did not scream. She simply looked at the girl, looked at her with the terrifying, ancient weight of 1,000 years of royalty. She looked at the stolen gold pressed against the rough wool of the servant's dress. She saw the terror in the girl's eyes, but she also saw something else. Defiance. The defiance of someone who believes they are loved, and that love makes them equal to queens. Eleanor turned and walked away. She left the girl standing in the freezing garden. She left the locket in her hands. To take it back would be to acknowledge a struggle, and Eleanor would not struggle with a servant. The truth was confirmed. The contract was broken. The king had not just strayed. He had abdicated his dignity. And now, the time for partnership was over. The time for accounting had begun. Eleanor returned to her chambers with the measured pace of a woman walking to the gallows, or perhaps a woman walking away from them. She dismissed her ladies in waiting with a wave of her hand, so abrupt it bordered on rude. When the heavy oak doors finally clicked shut, sealing her in the silence of her private sanctuary, she did not scream. She did not throw the porcelain vases against the wall. She did not weep. She walked to the window and looked out at the sprawling grounds of the palace, the kingdom she had spent 30 years fortifying. The pain she felt was not the sharp, hot sting of a lover scorned. It was something far heavier, far older. It was the crushing weight of a bankrupt investment. To understand Eleanor's humiliation, one must understand the currency of her life. She had not paid for her position with smiles or charm. She had paid for it with her lifeblood. She remembered the girl she had been at 16, shivering in a carriage crossing the snowy border, leaving behind every face she loved, every language she knew. She remembered the cold terror of the wedding night, lie beside a stranger who spoke of duty while he took what was his. She remembered the children. 3 of them lay in the royal crypt, tiny marble effigies that she visited on Sundays. She had birthed them in agony, mourned them in public with the stoic face required a queen, and buried her grief deep in the earth so that the kingdom would not see her falter. She had given her body to the state. She had given her youth to the state. She had carved out the soft parts of her soul and filled the hollows with steel so that she could be the partner Frederick needed. And now, she realized Frederick did not want partner. He did not want steel. He wanted a pillow. The humiliation was not that he sought pleasure. Kings had mistresses. It was the way of the world. The humiliation lay in the nature of his choice. Had he chosen a duchess, a woman of wit and standing, a political rival, Eleanor could have respected the maneuver. It would have been a chess move. But he had chosen a girl who scrubbed the floors. He had chosen a girl whose only qualification was that she looked at him with the adoration of a dog waiting for a scrap. This was the insult that burned the hottest. It revealed the truth about Frederick's character, that Eleanor had spent decades hiding from the world, and perhaps from herself. He was not a great man weary of greatness. He was a weak man tired of being held to a standard. Eleanor walked to her vanity table. The mirror there was old, the glass slightly silvered at the edges. She looked at her reflection. She traced the lines around her mouth, the deep grooves etched by years of holding her tongue when fools spoke, of forcing smiles at tedious banquets. She looked at her graying hair. Every strand was a testament to a crisis managed, a war averted, a scandal suppressed. She was a map of their shared reign. When Frederick looked at her, he saw the work. He saw the cost. He saw the mirror of his own aging obligation. But when he looked at Anna, he saw a blank slate. He saw a fiction. He saw a version of himself that was still young, still vibrant, still capable of being a hero without effort. He was trading the reality of their shared life for a cheap fantasy. She thought of the miniature portrait, the gold, the diamonds, money that should have gone to the repair of the northern fortresses. He was dismantling the foundations of the house they built to decorate a hovel. It made her feel foolish. It made her 30 years of discipline feel like a joke. She had been the guardian of his dignity, correcting his mistakes, smoothing his path, ensuring that history would remember him as a formidable king. She had propped up a hollow statue. And now, that statue was crumbling, not from the blows of an enemy, but from its own rot. She sat in the dimming light, her hands resting perfectly still in her lap. The shame was a physical thing, a nausea in her gut. The court would know soon, if they didn't already. They would see the king mooning like a schoolboy. They would see the maid wearing airs above her station. And they would look at Eleanor, the formidable, terrifying Queen Eleanor, and they would see a woman who could command armies but could not command her husband's respect. They would pity her. The thought of their pity was like acid. She would not be pitied. She would not be the tragic wife standing in the shadows while the king played his games. But she also knew she could not fight this with tears or arguments. To confront him would be to descend to his level. To scream at him would be to admit that he had the power to hurt her. And to demand he leave the girl would only drive him closer to her, fueling the romantic delusion that they were star-crossed lovers fighting against a cruel world. No, she stood up. The sun had set. The room was dark, save for the embers dying in the hearth. She had sacrificed her youth for this kingdom. She had sacrificed her happiness for this crown. She would not allow a senile man and a foolish girl to turn her life's work into a farce. The pain remained, a cold, hard knot in the center of her chest. But the humiliation was beginning to crystallize into something else. It was becoming clarity. The partnership was dissolved. The loyalty was voided. If he wished to act like a child, he would learn that the world is a dangerous place for children without guardians. She rang the bell for her servants. She needed to be dressed for dinner. There was a delegation from the Merchants' Guild arriving in the morning, and she had papers to review. The queen still had a kingdom to run, even if the king had decided to resign. The morning after the revelation in the garden, the sun rose with a blinding, indifferent brightness. It illuminated the dust motes dancing in the queen's chambers and the sharp lines of her face as she sat before her mirror. Her ladies-in-waiting moved around her with hushed efficiency, sensing the change in the atmosphere without understanding its source. They brushed her hair, they fastened the heavy brocade of her bodice, but they did not chatter. The queen was not in a mood for chatter. Eleanor was in a state of terrifying calm. In the stories of the common people, revenge is often depicted as a storm, a sudden violent outburst of passion, a dagger in the dark, a poisoned cup. But Eleanor was not a common woman, and hers was not a common grievance. A storm passes. A storm leaves wreckage that can be rebuilt. She did not wish to create a storm. She wished to create a winter, a slow, inevitable freeze that would kill the roots of the weed that had choked her garden without ever raising a hand in violence. She descended the great staircase to the breakfast hall. Frederick was already there. He looked up as she entered, his eyes darting nervously to her face. He was waiting for the accusation. He was braced for the scream, for the tears, for the scene that would allow him to play the role of the besieged victim. He had likely rehearsed his defense. He was lonely. He was misunderstood. He was seeking solace. But Eleanor gave him no scene. "Good morning, Frederick," she said. Her voice was level, smooth as polished glass. She took her seat at the opposite end of the long table. "The weather has turned, I believe. The roads will be difficult for the merchants." Frederick blinked. He slumped slightly, the tension leaking out of him, replaced by a confused relief. "Yes," he stammered. "Yes, quite difficult. I was thinking of postponing the hunt." "As you wish," she said, buttering her toast. She watched him eat. She watched him drink his coffee. And as she watched, she made her decision. For 30 years, Eleanor had been the invisible scaffold holding up the crumbling edifice of Frederick's competence. When he forgot a name during an audience, she supplied it. When he made a rash promise to a foreign duke, she quietly renegotiated the terms behind closed doors. When his temper flared and he threatened to dismiss a valuable minister, she was the one who smoothed the ruffled feathers and ensured the minister stayed. She had made him look strong. She had made him look wise. She had curated his image so carefully that even he had begun to believe it was real. He believed he was a great king who just happened to be married to a capable woman. He did not understand that he was a hollow man propped up by a spine of iron that was not his own. If she were to confront him now, if she were to banish the girl or demand an end to the affair, she would only become the villain in his narrative. He would resent her control. He would cling to the girl all the more tightly, fueled by the romance of forbidden love. No, she would not fight him. She would simply stop helping him. She would withdraw the scaffold. Later that morning, the Lord Chancellor, a shrewd man named Baron von Hest, requested an audience. He came bearing a stack of documents regarding the grain tariffs, a complex, tedious issue that threatened to spark riots in the southern provinces if mishandled. Usually this was how it went. The Chancellor would present the problem to the king. The king would look bored and glance at Eleanor. Eleanor would ask the pertinent questions, guide the discussion, and subtly instruct the king on which decision to authorize. The king would stamp the paper, feeling kingly, and the crisis would be averted. Today, the Chancellor stood before them. "Your Majesties," he began, "the guild masters are demanding a reduction in the levy. If we refuse, they threaten to halt shipments to the capital. However, if we agree, the Treasury will face a significant shortfall." Frederick sighed, tapping his fingers on the arm of his throne. He looked at Eleanor. It was a signal. "Tell me what to do." Eleanor looked back at him. She saw the expectancy in his eyes. She saw the lazy reliance. She smiled, a thin, faint expression that did not reach her eyes. Then she turned to the Chancellor. "The king has been giving this matter a great deal of thought." Eleanor lied smoothly. "He has developed a very specific perspective on the power of the guilds. I would not presume to speak for him." She turned back to Frederick, folding her hands in her lap. "Well, Frederick, the Chancellor awaits your command." The silence that followed was excruciating. Frederick froze. His mouth opened slightly, then closed. He looked at the Chancellor, then back at Eleanor, waiting for the lifeline, waiting for the whisper. Waiting for the nod, there was only silence. Frederick stammered. He pulled at his collar. The guilds, yes, they are troublesome. Indeed, sire, the chancellor pressed, sensing the vacuum. But the decision? Do we lower the levy or hold firm? Frederick's eyes darted around the room. He looked desperate. He looked small. We must be firm. Yes, firm. Tell them. Tell them the crown does not negotiate with threats. It was the wrong answer. It was the answer of a man playing at strength, unaware of the delicate economic balance at play. To refuse them outright, without negotiation, would guarantee a strike. It would mean bread shortages within the month. In the past, Eleanor would have intervened. She would have said, perhaps, Your Majesty, we might offer a temporary suspension rather than a refusal. But today, she said nothing. She simply nodded. You heard the king, Lord Chancellor. The crown remains firm. The Chancellor looked at Eleanor, confused, searching for the correction. When none came, he bowed low, hiding the alarm in his eyes. As you command, Your Majesty. He backed out of the room, leaving a heavy silence in his wake. Frederick let out a breath, looking pleased with himself. There, he said, puffed up by his own voice. One must show strength, Eleanor. You worry too much. You are quite right, my husband, she replied softly. I have worried too much for far too long. She stood up. I believe I shall retire to my library. You have the afternoon audience with the bishop to prepare for. I am sure you will handle it with the same decisiveness. She walked out of the throne room. Her heart was beating hard, but her hands were steady. She had pulled the first stone from the wall. He had made a mistake, a significant one, and soon there would be consequences. She was not destroying him. She was merely allowing him to be himself. And that, she knew, would be the most tragic revenge of all. A kingdom does not rot from the outside in. It rots from the head down. And so, the winter turned into spring, and the rot began to spread, not with the violence of plague, but with the quiet persistence of rust eating through iron. Eleanor's strategy was terrifying in its simplicity. She did not poison the king's wine. She simply ceased to be his antidote. For 3 decades, she had been the filter through which the world reached Frederick, and the lens through which Frederick appeared to the world. She had softened the harsh light of reality for him, and sharpened his blurred image for others. Now, she stepped aside and let the light burn him. She adopted a new refrain, a phrase that she repeated with the gentle, maddening consistency of metronome. The king knows best. When the ministers came to her, frantic about the rising price of grain caused by the king's refusal to negotiate with the guilds, Eleanor did not offer a solution. She sat at her embroidery frame, pulling the needle through the silk with rhythmic precision, and said, My husband is a divinely anointed sovereign. His wisdom is of a higher order than ours. We must trust his vision. The ministers would leave her chambers confused and disheartened, forced to return to a king who had no vision, only whims. Frederick, for his part, initially felt a surge of euphoric liberation. He felt as though a heavy wool coat had been lifted from his shoulders. Eleanor was no longer correcting his grammar in speeches. She was no longer kicking his shin under the table when he drank too much. She was no longer insisting he read the tedious briefing papers on trade routes and border disputes. He believed he was finally ruling. In reality, he was merely drifting. Without Eleanor's rigorous scheduling, the king's day began to disintegrate. He slept late, keeping the court waiting for hours. He canceled audiences with seasoned diplomats to go riding with Anna, who sat a horse poorly and laughed too loudly for the solemnity of the royal grounds. Anna's influence began to seep into the cracks of the state. She was not a malicious girl, but she was ignorant. She saw the world through the lens of a fairy tale, where kings were omnipotent and money was infinite. She whispered in Frederick's ear that the people loved him, that the grumbling in the city squares was merely the noise of ungrateful wretches. She told him he looked majestic in the new, garish velvet coats she encouraged him to wear, coats that made him look less like a monarch and more like a traveling player. And Frederick, starved for flattery, drank it down like sweet wine. He began to make appointments based on Anna's preferences rather than political necessity. He granted a title to her cousin, a man known for cheating at cards. He dismissed the court musician, a virtuoso of 30 years, because Anna found his music too gloomy, and replaced him with a lute player who knew only bawdy tavern songs. The court, a living organism that feeds on respect and fear, began to recoil. The older nobles, men who had served with Frederick's father, watched with stone-faced horror. They saw the king giggling in corners. They saw the disarray of the council meetings, where papers were lost and decisions were made on the roll of a die. They looked to Eleanor for intervention, but she remained unreadable. She attended every function, dressed in impeccable, somber dignity. She stood one step behind the king, her hands folded, her face a mask of dutiful submission. When he stumbled over his words, she did not prompt him. When he spilled wine on his doublet, she did not wipe it away. She let him stand there, stained and stammering, while the ambassadors of Europe watched in polite, excruciating silence. By refusing to cover his shame, she forced the court to look at it. There was a specific incident in May that marked the point of no return. The annual reception for the high clergy was an event of immense gravity. In the past, Eleanor had spent weeks preparing Frederick, briefing him on the intricate theological disputes and the names of the visiting cardinals. This year, she told him nothing. Frederick arrived at the reception flushed and unprepared, having spent the afternoon at a picnic with Anna. He mistook the cardinal of the north for the bishop of the south, a grave insult given the rivalry between the two dioceses. He made a joke about the monastic vow of poverty while wearing a coat dripping with unnecessary jewels. The silence in the great hall was absolute. The cardinal's face turned the color of ash. Frederick, sensing the tension but unable to understand it, turned to look for Eleanor. He looked for the whisper, the nudge, the saving grace. Eleanor met his gaze. She stood tall, regal, and utterly distant. She offered him a small, bewildered smile, as if to say, "I am just a woman. I cannot help you." Frederick was left alone in the center of the room, drowning in the silence he had created. He stammered an apology that sounded weak, then retreated early, leaving Eleanor to bid farewell to the guests. As the doors closed behind him, the atmosphere in the room shifted. The cardinals and the dukes did not look at the empty throne with reverence. They looked at it with contempt. And then they turned their eyes to the queen. They saw her standing amidst the wreckage of the evening, calm and unbroken. They saw her dignity in the face of his disgrace. Eleanor knew then that the plan was working. She was not destroying the king's power. She was letting it migrate. Authority flows to the vessel that can hold it. Frederick was leaking power with every breath. And without lifting a finger to claim it, Eleanor was becoming the only solid thing left in the kingdom. The isolation of the traitor had begun. He was still wearing the crown, but the room was slowly backing away from him. There is a specific kind of loneliness that exists only in crowded rooms. It is the isolation of a man who speaks and realizes that, although everyone is listening, no one is truly hearing him. By midsummer, the king began to feel a draft. It was not a wind that came from the windows, but chill that radiated from the people around him. In the beginning, he had mistaken the silence of the court for awe. He thought they were stunned by his new vitality, by the colorful waistcoats and the youthful energy he displayed with Anna on his arm. But as the weeks wore on, the silence began to curdle. It grew heavy, thick with unspoken judgment. The isolation began in the council chamber. For decades, the council had been a place of heated debate. The dukes and ministers would argue with Frederick, challenging his ideas, pushing back against his edicts until a compromise was hammered out. It was exhausting, but it was a sign of engagement. It meant they believed his decisions mattered. Now the debates had ceased. Frederick sat at the head of the heavy oak table, a map of the province spread before him. He was proposing a new hunting lodge in the western forest, a suggestion Anna had made, claiming the air there would be good for his lungs. It was a frivolous expense at a time when the grain riots in the south were turning violent. But Frederick was determined to show his authority. "We shall allocate the funds from the river dredging project," Frederick announced, tapping the map with a manicured finger. "The river can wait another year. The lodge is a necessity for the crown's health." He looked around the table, waiting for the treasurer to object. He waited for the chancellor to talk about the risk of flooding. He waited for the familiar friction of governance. Instead, the treasurer simply bowed his head. "As your majesty commands." The chancellor did not look up from his notes. It shall be done. There was no argument. There was no discussion. They agreed to his demands with the placid, patronizing tone one uses with a senile relative or a petulant child. They gave him what he wanted because they no longer respected him enough to fight him. They knew the lodge would likely never be built. The bureaucracy would stall the funds. The orders would be lost in transit, and the king, distracted by his next whim, would forget he ever asked for it. Frederick felt a flush of irritation rise in his neck. "Does no one have anything to say?" he demanded. "Is the council devoid of opinion today?" The men remained silent. Their eyes flickered briefly to the end of the table, where Queen Eleanor sat. Eleanor was reading a letter. She did not look up. She did not signal the treasurer to speak. She did not bridge the gap. She let the silence hang, stretching it until it became unbearable. "Very well," Frederick snapped, pushing his chair back. "If you are all so dull-witted today, I shall leave you to your papers." He stormed out of the chamber. He expected footsteps to follow him. He expected the chancellor to run after him, begging for clarification. But the heavy doors closed with a final hollow thud, and no one followed. Behind the doors, the murmur of serious conversation resumed immediately. The sound of men getting back to the real work of the kingdom, work in which the king was no longer a participant. He sought out Anna. He needed her adoration to fill the hole the council had left. He found her in the solar, trying on a necklace of pearls he had given her. "They are useless," Frederick complained, pacing the room. "Old men with ink in their veins. They do not understand vision, Anna. They do not understand life." He waited for her to comfort him, to offer some insight, some soothing wisdom that would make sense of the world. Anna looked up, her eyes bright and vacant. "But the lodge will have a balcony, won't it, Frederick? I should like a balcony to watch the sunset." Frederick stopped pacing. He looked at her. For the first time, the fog of infatuation cleared just enough for him to see the reality. He was talking about the paralysis of his government, about the disrespect of his peers, and she was talking about a balcony. He realized with a sudden, sinking dread that she could not help him. She was a sweet confection, a thing of sugar and air. But a man cannot live on sugar. He cannot build a reign on air. "Yes," he said, his voice flat. "A balcony." He left her and walked into the corridors. He began to notice the mechanism of his isolation everywhere. When he entered a room, conversation stopped. The courtiers would bow, deep and respectful, but they would not meet his eyes. They moved away from him like water parting around a stone. He saw the Lord Chamberlain whispering to the Queen in an alcove. They were discussing something intense, their heads close together. When Frederick approached, they stopped. "What is it?" Frederick asked, trying to sound authoritative. "What are you plotting?" Eleanor turned to him. Her face was serene, but her eyes were like the windows of an empty house. "We were merely discussing the menu for the harvest feast. Husband, it is of no concern to you. We would not wish to bore you with domestic trifles." It was a lie. He knew it was a lie. They had been discussing the grain riots. They had been discussing the survival of the dynasty. But she was shutting him out, not with malice, but with a terrifying politeness. She was treating him as a guest in his own palace. He realized then that he had lost the protection of her intelligence. By betraying her, he had not just lost a wife. He had lost his interpreter. He had lost the only person who had ever told him the truth. That evening, he ate dinner alone. Anna was sulking because he had not stayed to discuss the lodge. Eleanor had declined to dine, citing a headache. The king sat at the head of the long table, surrounded by empty chairs. The candles flickered in the draught. The servants moved in the shadows, faceless and silent. He poured his own wine. The clink of the bottle against the goblet echoed in the vast, high-ceilinged room. He took a sip, but the wine tasted sour. He looked down the length of the table to where Eleanor used to sit. He remembered how she would look at him over the rim of her glass, her eyes conveying 1,000 unspoken messages, warnings, encouragements, shared jokes. Now, there was nothing but polished wood and cold air. He was the king of the realm, the absolute monarch, the chosen of God, and he had never been more irrelevant in his life. The isolation was absolute. The traitor had built his own prison, and now he was finding that the walls were too high to climb. Tragedy is rarely a thunderstorm that tears the roof off the house. More often, it is a slow accumulation of dust in a room that was once full of life. It is a silence that settles into the corners, heavier than any shout. For King Frederick, the true cause of his betrayal did not reveal itself in the grand council chambers or the ledger books of the treasury. It revealed itself in the terrible, quiet moments of the everyday. It was late autumn now. The leaves in the royal park had turned the color of dried blood and were rotting into the mud. The palace, always drafty, had become a cavern of shifting shadows. Frederick sat in his private study. The fire was roaring, fed by a servant who had bowed and vanished. But the warmth did not seem to reach him. His left hand, the one that held the scepter at his coronation, was aching. It was a deep, gnawing pain in the joints, a herald of rain that would come by morning. For 20 years, this had been a shared ritual. In the evenings, when the castle grew quiet, Eleanor would sit opposite him. She would notice him rubbing his knuckles. She always noticed, and she would rise without a word. She would take a small jar of ointment, smelling of beeswax and camphor, and she would massage his hand. She would not speak of statecraft then. She would not scold. She would simply work the ache out of his bones with her strong, cool thumbs. It was a moment of service that had nothing to do with the crown and everything to do with the man. Now he rubbed his own hand. His skin felt papery and dry against itself. The pain remained a dull, throbbing reminder that he was an old man and he was alone. The door opened. It was Anna. She swept in with a rustle of silk that was too loud for the room. She was wearing a gown of bright yellow, a color that jarred against the somber oak paneling. She was laughing at something a guard had said in the corridor. "Frederick," she chirped, oblivious to the atmosphere. "Look, the milliner has sent the ribbons. Which shade do you prefer, the crimson or the rose?" She held up 2 strips of fabric, waving them like flags. Frederick looked at the ribbons, then he looked at her face. It was a pretty face, unlined and smooth, but it was a face that had never seen a war. It was a face that had never waited up until dawn, while a fever burned through a child. It was a face that knew nothing of his pain. "The crimson," he said, his voice raspy. He didn't care. "I think the rose," she said, tossing the crimson onto his desk, right on top of a dispatch from a boarder. "It makes me look younger, don't you think?" She swirled around the room, picking up objects and putting them down, humming that incessant tune. She was a bird trapped in a library, fluttering against the stillness. Frederick closed his eyes. He found himself longing, with a physical intensity, for Eleanor's silence. Eleanor knew how to be in a room without consuming it. She knew that sometimes 2 people could sit together reading separate books, and the silence between them was not a void, but a bridge. Anna came over and sat on the arm of his chair. She ran her fingers through his thinning hair. "You are grumpy tonight," she teased. "You need more wine." She did not see his hand. She did not see the gray pallor of his skin. She saw a king who existed to buy her ribbons. "I am tired, Anna," he said. "You're always tired lately," she pouted, standing up. "It is boring, Frederick. The court is so dull. No one dances anymore." She wandered out, leaving the door slightly ajar. Frederick stared at the gap in the doorway. A draft of cold air whistled through it. He stood up, his joints protesting, and walked to the window. He looked out across the courtyard to the Queen's wing. Her lights were burning. He imagined her there. Was she reading? Was she writing letters? Was she thinking of him? He remembered a morning years ago. They had been breakfasting on the terrace. He had dropped his fork, a clumsy mistake. He had looked at her in embarrassment. She had simply picked up her own fork and dropped it too, making a louder clatter, then laughed. It was a small kindness, a conspiracy of 2 against the rigid etiquette of the world. He realized now that those small kindnesses were the mortar that held a life together. Without them, the bricks were just loose stones, grinding against each other. He turned back to the room. The crimson ribbon lay on his desk like a wound. The fire popped, a lonely sound. He wanted to go to her. He wanted to walk across the courtyard, knock on her door, and ask her, not for forgiveness, That was too big a word. But just to sit in the chair opposite him. He wanted her to look at him and know, without being told, that his hand hurt. But he could not. The distance between the king's wing and the queen's wing was only 100 yards of stone, but he had dug a canyon there that no bridge could span. He sat back down and massaged his own hand, alone in the firelight. The ache did not go away. We often make the mistake of believing that morality is a set of rules imposed upon us by the church or the state, a list of forbidden things we must not do lest we be punished. But those who have lived long enough know that morality is more like the laws of physics. It is the law of cause and effect. If you plant thistles, you cannot expect to harvest wheat. If you build a house on sand, you cannot blame the wind when it collapses. The collapse of King Frederick's dignity did not happen in private. It happened, as these things must, in the full glare of the public eye, where the contrast between what a man pretends to be and what has become is most stark. It was the occasion of the winter solstice banquet, the most solemn feast of the year. The great hall was hung with tapestries of ancient battles, reminders of the blood and iron that had forged the kingdom. Every duke, earl, and foreign ambassador was present, a sea of velvet and watchful eyes. In previous years, this banquet was a display of monolithic unity. The king and queen would sit side by side, a two-headed eagle of state. Eleanor would guide the conversation, steering it away from dangerous waters, while Frederick provided the booming voice of authority. They were a performance that the world believed in. But this year, the script had been rewritten. Frederick sat on his throne, his face flushed with wine, his wig slightly askew. He had insisted that Anna be present, not at the high table. Protocol forbade it, but seated prominently near the dais, dressed in a gown of shimmering blue that cost more than a regiment of soldiers. She was giggling, whispering to a page, drawing the eye of every man in the room, not with admiration, but with the leering curiosity one reserves for a carnival attraction. The ambassador from the Southern Empire rose to offer a toast. He was a man known for his wit, which was as sharp and cold as a razor. He looked at the king, then he looked at the giggling girl, and finally, he looked at Queen Eleanor, who sat like a statue carved from ice. To King Frederick, the ambassador said, his voice carrying to the rafters, a monarch who has proven that the wisdom of age need not burden the spirit of youth. May we all find such distractions to keep the winter cold at bay. It was a devastating insult. It reduced the king's reign to a senile dalliance. It mocked his judgment and stripped him of his gravity in a single sentence. The hall went deathly silent. Every breath was held. The dukes looked at their plates. The insult hung in the air, vibrating. In the old days, Eleanor would have saved him. She would have stood up, glass in hand, and turned the ambassador's words back on him with a retort so clever and so gracious that the insult would have evaporated, leaving the king untouched. She would have shielded his honor with her own. Frederick, sensing the shift in the room but too dulled by wine and vanity to understand the nuance, smiled uncertainly. He looked to his left. He looked to Eleanor. His eyes were pleading. He was a man drowning in deep water, looking for the hand that had always pulled him out. Fix this, his eyes said. Tell them who I am. Make them stop looking at me like this. Eleanor met his gaze. Her face was not angry. It was not smug. It was simply empty of obligation. She looked at him not as a wife, but as a witness. She did not stand. She did not speak. She picked up her goblet, took a small, measured sip of water, and set it back down. The silence stretched on, becoming a physical weight. The king was left naked before his court. The shield was gone. Frederick's smile faltered. He realized, with a sudden, horrifying clarity, that the ambassador was laughing at him. He realized that the entire room was laughing at him, even if their mouths were not moving. He looked at Anna, hoping to find strength there, but saw only a foolish girl preening in a blue dress, oblivious to the fact that she was a punchline of a joke she didn't understand. He had traded a fortress for a tent. He had traded the respect of peers for the flattery of a servant. And now, the wind had come and the tent was blowing away. The moral of the moment was written on every face in the hall. Power does not protect honor. You can wear the crown, you can hold the scepter, you can command the armies, but you cannot command respect if you have debased yourself. Betrayal is not free. The price Frederick had paid for his second youth was his legacy. He had broken the covenant of his marriage, believing it was a private matter, a small indulgence. But there are no private matters for a king. By betraying Eleanor, he had betrayed the mechanism of his own greatness. He slumped back in his throne, a small, old man in a chair that was too big for him. The banquet continued, the noise rising around him, but he was no longer the center of it. He was a ghost at his own feast. Eleanor sat beside him, untouchable in her dignity. She had not raised a hand against him. She had not whispered a single rumor. She had simply let him be exactly who he had chosen to be. And that was the harshest judgment of all. The end did not come with the crashing of gates or the sounding of trumpets. It came with the quiet rustle of linen and the smell of dried lavender in the sick room. King Frederick took to his bed in the early thaw of March. The physicians called it congestion of the lungs, but the court knew better. It was a congestion of the spirit. The man had simply run out of the will to pretend. In those final weeks, the palace grew hushed. The music stopped. The bright yellow ribbons and the garish waistcoats were packed away in cedar chests, ghosts of a carnival that had packed up and left town. And with the carnival went the carnival goers. Anna did not stay. She was a creature of sunshine and easy laughter, and the sick room terrified her. The smell of sickness, the rattling breath of a dying man, the oppressive weight of impending history. It was too much reality for a fantasy to bear. She visited once, standing by the door, twisting her handkerchief, looking at the gray, shrunken figure in the bed with the eyes of a stranger. She left within minutes, and within a week, she had requested permission to return to her family in the country. Frederick signed the order with a shaking hand. He did not ask her to stay. The delusion had finally burned itself out, leaving only the ash of truth. On the final night, as the rain lashed against the stone walls, Frederick sent the physicians away. He asked for the queen. Eleanor came. She was dressed in black velvet, her silver hair pulled back in the severe, elegant style she had worn for 40 years. She walked to the side of the bed and looked down at him. She did not weep. She did not wring her hands. She stood with the stillness of a cathedral. Frederick looked up at her. His eyes were milky, but for a moment they held the clarity of the man he used to be, the man who had ridden beside her in the coronation procession, the man who had signed the treaties she drafted, the partner. Eleanor, he whispered. The name was a cracked sound, dry as a dead leaf. I am here, Frederick, she said. Her voice was not cold, but it was distant. It was the voice one uses to speak to a traveler who is already halfway out the door. He reached out his hand, the hand she had once massaged, the hand that had signed away his dignity. He wanted her to take it. He wanted the connection. He wanted, in this final terrifying moment, to feel the steel of her strength supporting him one last time. He struggled for breath. I have made a mess of things. Yes, she said. She did not offer him the lie. She did not say, it is all right or you did your best. She respected him enough, at the very end, to give him the truth. You have. I missed you, he said, tears leaking from the corners of his eyes, tracking to the deep lines of his face. Even when you were right there, I missed you. Eleanor looked at his hand, trembling on the coverlet. She looked at the face of the man she had married, the man she had served, the man who had discarded her for a season of foolishness. She felt a great, yawning emptiness in her chest. It was not anger anymore. It was not even pity. It was simply the realization that the bridge was gone. He was on the other side of the river, and she could not reach him. She did not take his hand. Instead, she reached out and adjusted the blanket over his shoulder, a gesture of duty, of care, but not of intimacy. Rest now, Frederick, she said softly. The work is done. He looked at her hand, the hand that had withdrawn, and he understood. He closed his eyes. He died an hour later, in the silence of the room, while the queen sat in the chair by the window, watching the rain wash the world clean. The funeral was magnificent. The banners flew at half-mast. The bells tolled for 3 days. The court wore black, and the ambassadors wrote home about the solemn grandeur of the proceedings. Queen Eleanor stood at the head of the crypt as the marble lid was slid into place. She was the regent now, The power was hers, fully and legally. The court looked to her with relief, eager for the return of order, for the return of the iron rule that kept the wolves at bay. She had won. The traitor was gone. The rival had fled. The kingdom was hers. But as she walked back through the empty corridors of the palace, her footsteps echoing on the stone, Eleanor felt the true price of her victory. She walked into the king's study. It was exactly as he had left it. The crimson ribbon was still on the desk, gathering dust. She picked it up. It was a cheap thing, fraying at the edges. She looked at the empty chair opposite the desk. For 30 years, there had been 2 of them, 2 soldiers, 2 pilots. Now there was one. She realized then that revenge is not a sweet wine. It is a dry bread. It sustains you, it keeps you alive, but it gives no pleasure. She had preserved her dignity. She had preserved the crown. But she had watched the only person who truly knew her destroy himself, and she had done nothing to stop it. She dropped the ribbon into the fire. She watched it curl and blacken, turning to ash in seconds. She straightened her spine. She adjusted her cuffs. There were ministers waiting in the council chamber. There were grain tariffs to negotiate. There was a kingdom to run. Queen Eleanor opened the door and walked out into the hall, alone, strong, and utterly, devastatingly hollow. The vow had been broken, and though the kingdom stood, the heart of it had stopped beating long ago. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the corridors of history and the human heart. It is a heavy tale, but one that reminds us that the choices we make in the autumn of our lives are just as heavy as those we make in spring. If you found value in this story, I invite you to subscribe to the channel and join our community of thinkers and listeners. And before you go, I leave you with this question to ponder in the quiet of your own evening. If it were you, standing by that bedside, would you have taken his hand? Or is there a distance that even death cannot bridge? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Until next time,